Hello everyone, how is everyone doing? I hope everyone is doing great. And today we're going to talk about a very important concept of programming, which is API, Application Programming Interface. It's really important to understand, especially to understand how JavaScript works. So, without any further ado, let's get started. So, there are basically three terms. One is application, programming, and interface. And we shall understand one by one. Let's start with interface. What is an interface? First, we need to see that. So, interface is something that basically connects two entities or two systems. That's it. That is what is an interface. We will see some example for better understanding. So here you can see this guy, he knows English, and this guy, he knows French. They want to communicate with each other. How are they going to communicate? They don't know the same language. So they have language barrier. For that, we need a human interface who basically knows both English and French. So this guy will make the communication happen. That is why we will call him human interface. Let's see one more example. This is a very classic example. We all know about GUI, graphical user interface. So here is a simple graphical user interface. We are all familiar with this. Like there are some basically basic information to take in a form, like first name, last name, email, and password. And there are basically two buttons. Okay, it's simple GUI. Now the question is, why is it called graphical user interface? So interface basically connects two entities. What is it connecting? It is connecting the user with the CPU. Why? Because the language of the CPU is binary, which is 0 and 1, and the language of the user is English. So the user does not understand the language of the CPU, and the CPU does not understand the language of the user. That is why we need an interface in between that will basically make the communication happen. And this is what the GUI is doing. So the communication is happening between both the CPU and the user. So that is why it is basically called a GUI, a graphical user interface. If you didn't know it, now you know it. Let's see a hardware interface. So we all know pen drive. We use it to copy data from pen drive to processor, basically in our computer. So for that communication to happen between two devices, there is a circuit. And that circuit is basically called interface circuit. That is making the communication happen between the pen drive and the processor. Okay, so every time you are inserting the pen drive in your computer, just know there is an interface circuit that knows both of their protocols. So that is making the communication happen between them. So that's an example of hardware interface. So in API, there were three terms, and we have cracked the interface part. We have understood it. I hope it's 100% clear now. Now let's see what is application and programming. The name clearly suggests that it is nothing but code. Programming, we do programming for what? To create application. Simple. So this is nothing but code. So in API, application and programming, it basically means code. And the interface part, it is basically saying that it is connecting something. So what is it connecting? It is connecting our application with a new feature. So API is nothing but bunch of functions. You know the input and the output of the function. That's it. That is all you know. You do not need to know the implementation. That's an API for you. So that means all the packages that we have been using, like npm packages or any other package, that is actually an API for us. Now the question is, what is web API? Let's see that. In web API, there are basically two terms, web and API. And we know the API, it is basically bunch of functions that we shall use. We do not know the implementation. We only know the input and output. So that's an API for us. When shall we call it web API? If we can execute these functions over the internet, then we will call this web API. So there is a client. From the client, a request will be sent, and that request will basically execute this function. and it will return the output as the response to the client. That's it. That is a web API. Why can we do that? We can do that because it follows HTTP protocol. Anything that follows HTTP protocol, we can access that through a HTTP URL. So this URL is pointing exactly to this function. If we send a request in this URL, it will basically execute this function. So this is what is web API. Now the question is, this is a course on JavaScript. Why am I talking about API? We first need to know that the compiler of the JavaScript is basically a browser or a node. In the front end, it is browser. In the back end, it is node. And these browser and node provides a lot of APIs to the JavaScript environment. Basically, a lot of functions. Why does JavaScript need these functions? You know that JavaScript is a toy language. JavaScript only does pretty much the basic things, not more than that. But we can develop fully functional production level application with JavaScript. How can we do that? We can do that because browser and node is providing a lot of functionalities to JavaScript. And how the JavaScript environment and the node and browser environment work, how do they collaborate, we will see that in the next lecture. But before that, I want to give you a clarification. Here in the MDN documentation, you will see the term web API. And I have already explained to you what is web API. This is not actually the web API. By web API, they actually meant web browser API. The browser API and node API that just I talked about, they actually meant it. So every time you see the term web API in the documentation, like here, just know that they actually meant web browser API. And if you read the documentation, you will see there are bunch of APIs that is provided by the browser environment to the JavaScript environment, like set timeout, fetch, document.get, element by ID. These are all web browser API. And of course, how do they work? How do they collaborate? The JavaScript environment and the browser environment. We'll see that in the next lecture. So see you in the next lecture.